All right. I know I'm pumping out the videos this week. I'm just trying to get ready for Sunday. I honestly don't think I'm going to get all the stuff out that I want to get out before Sunday, but I'm going to try anyway. I've been busting my hump this past week trying to get all these slides done. It's been tough, but it's been good. I'm exhausted, still fighting a cold, but that's all right. We're going to get through this. All right. Let's pick up at New Shores for Samuel Moore. To start the story, we have to go back to 1950. Seems like the 1950s were a ripe time period for these men and their passion for the Bible. Samuel Moore, while he's aged in our photo here, our story picks up with him at the age of 19 in Beirut, Lebanon. American missionaries had come to his home in Lebanon and started a school. Samuel attended the school and he really admired the selfless lifestyle of the missionaries, but preferred to live a life that was surrounded by alcohol and women. And he lived this lifestyle with his buddy Charlie. Now, Charlie was dating a girl and they had become engaged, and his lifestyle, Charlie's lifestyle and Samuel Moore's lifestyle, uh, was not conducive to him being faithful to this girl that he had been engaged to. And one morning, Samuel, the man we're talking about here, was walking to Charlie's house, and he walked in on Charlie's fiancée with a gun in her hand over Charlie's lifeless body. And he says this about that event: the first thing that came to mind is that Charlie is a fine boy from one of the finest cities in the city. He died and he didn't have peace with God. Here I am, wanting to become a Christian, but I was living for the devil. That was the day I became a born again Christian. Samuel made his way to South Carolina. He flew to South Carolina to go to school. He wanted to go to South Carolina University, and he only had like $600 in his pocket. With no way to pay for his tuition, he saw an ad that said he could make $100 a week selling Bibles door to door. He recalls that he made $18 the first week, and he said he wanted to quit 100 times over and over because people just, slamming the door every day in his face, he said, was really discouraging. Working this job helped him develop his personal motto, which was, when you hear no, reverse the letters and you go on. Okay, no and on there, right? So he was working 75 hours a week, and he managed to save $2,600 that summer. And he also got promoted, and he was a supervisor overseeing other salesmen. He got through all 4 years of college, and he got his bachelor's and master's degree. He bought a car, and he had saved up $10,000. He took a job at a bank, and then he realized that he could make more money selling Bibles. So in 1957, Samuel moved west and followed the business model he had learned and started his own business selling Bibles. Moore had recruited 23 college students to help him sell Bibles, and by the end of the summer, he had made $27,000. And he said that was 3 times more than what the bank would have paid him that year. So he did that in the summer. Business was booming for Moore, and in 1969, his business caught the eye of Thomas Nelson. And they offered Samuel Moore a job to oversee the American division of Thomas Nelson. Thomas Nelson's been around a long time. We talked about them. And so working for Thomas Nelson would be a huge opportunity for Moore, but he had other plans. Moore scraped together about $2.5 million and then bought Thomas Nelson outright. So he became their owner. They offered him a position, and he decided to buy them instead. So Moore made a living selling Bibles and now is the owner of one of the largest and oldest Bible publishers in the world. Moore recognized that his calling was to honor God through business. People here in this company love God. That's what he said, right? People here in this company love God too. And they have a mission to do a good return to the shareholders' equity, to honor God in their lives, and to help humanity. When you believe in what you're doing, you get fired up, Moore said. Moore went to First Baptist Church in Nashville and attended every Sunday school lesson and the Sunday services. He opened all of his management meetings with prayer and would read from the Bible. He always gives God the glory for his success that he achieved, saying it had nothing to do with anything he did in and of himself, but it was a work that God did through him. Now, about 10 years before this time frame, so I got 1969 up there, Samuel Moore married his wife Peggy, and they had 3 children. And Moore loved his trusty KJV Bible, and he loved reading that Bible. Now, about 10 years into this, he was doing family devotions with his kids, and his 10-year-old son, Joe, during family devotions, asked his father, "Daddy, you make so many Bibles. Why can't you make a Bible that I can understand?" And yeah, that must have pulled on his heartstrings because that's what started his journey. And can I just say, at this point, pretty much most of the translations we've talked about, the NIV, the NASB, and the NLT, they're all spurred on by men who have people they love and they just want them to understand the Bible. And when you hear this question once, it's easy to shrug off, but Moore heard these types of things multiple times. So Thomas Nelson was not new to the translation world. They had done the ERV. Not the ERV. They didn't do the ERV. They did the revision to the ERV, which was the 1901 ASV. But they hadn't done anything since. And up to this point in history, Thomas Nelson's storefront would have consisted of the ASV, the RSV, and their number one selling Bible by far, with over 60% of their sales, was the KJV. Moore is a businessman, and looking at the Bible market, this is what was available at the time. The Living Bible was absolutely dominating in sales. The RSV and the NASB numbers were strong contenders with each other. The NIV was a new kid on the block, still getting its feet wet, but it was getting well received at the time. And it's only the New Testament. The NIV itself, the whole Bible, hadn't been published yet. So at this point, just the New Testament's out. And the ASV and the Amplified Bibles are still decent in sales, but nothing in compared to the others. The KJV still had an excellent market share, and all of these Bibles were born out of 2 major issues: the old scholarship and old language. But they all lack something the KJV had: tradition. The KJV's biggest strength was in its tradition. It was trusted. It was time-proven. Clearly, people wanted something that was accessible in modern English, hence the sales of these other Bibles. Clearly, people wanted solid academic scholarship, because that's how these Bibles were often marketed. But these Bibles just didn't have that tradition. And Samuel Moore loved the tradition of the KJV. He wanted to retain that tradition more than anything else, but he wanted it accessible in modern English. He wanted to make the old tradition new. Samuel Moore wanted to test the market, though, to see how the public would respond to a KJV that was more accessible. So he created a study Bible with a concordance, maps, illustrations, study notes, and those study notes helped explain the text. The Open Bible was an immediate success. It became Thomas Nelson's number one selling Bible. Feedback from parents especially said that they would love to stick with the KJV if only their kids could understand it the way they could understand it when they used the Open Bible. Thousands of letters poured in, praising the Open Bible for its study helps. But the same complaint was received over and over that the text of the translation was difficult. People wanted to understand their Bible, their traditional Bible, in contemporary English. Many of the complaints were the same, complaining about the these and the thous and the verb endings like eth and est. The parents wanted the Bible to sound like the study notes, accessible, contemporary English. They trusted the KJV. It had a track record, and it was familiar to them. And so that was it. Samuel Moore needed to pursue this direction. The tradition wasn't dead, it was alive and well. It was just clouded by language that the average person struggled to see through. So Samuel Moore was a savvy businessman, but he was not a scholar. He was going to need some help to get this project off the ground. The man for that job would be the chief editor at Thomas Nelson, Arthur Farstad. Arthur Farstad was a well-credentialed original language scholar. He would be the chair of the translation committee eventually, but there was no committee yet. Right now, there's just an idea, a desire, and a market demand. From August to November, Arthur Farstad convened 3 conferences to express the heart of the project to prospective translators. The first meeting was at Hyatt Regency in Nashville, Tennessee, and that meeting gained them 68 translators, almost all entirely from the Southern Baptist denomination. The second meeting in Hilton O'Hare, Chicago, gained them even more translators, and this one was specifically to gain translators from other denominations to help make it ecumenical, so it wasn't a sectarian translation. There they picked up Presbyterians, Anglicans, Episcopalians, Wesleyans, and non-denominational as well. The third meeting was held, and hopefully you recognize that picture there, because this is the third meeting here. This is really cool in my opinion. I think this was a great move on Samuel Moore's part. The third meeting took place in London at Hampton Court, the same place that King James made the decision to pursue the revision to the Bishop's Bible. It was the origin of the KJV. This third conference would establish the second translation committee. There would be an American committee and a British committee, and a total of 130 scholars on the translation committee from both, on the total translation committee. Thomas More wanted the English to be accessible to Americans, but not at the cost of losing that British touch that the KJV has. He wanted the translation to be international as well. The purpose for this translation was laid out in these conferences, and it ended with the translators all signing a statement of faith. Statement of purpose. This is where the statement of faith will come in. The purpose of this project is to preserve the original intended purity of the King James Version in its communication of God's word to man. Insofar as is humanly and textually possible, the intention is to clarify this translation by the use of current words, grammar, and structure and sentence structure, so that this edition of the King James Version will speak to the individual reader in this final quarter of the 20th century in as clear, simple, and accurate a manner as the original translators of the King James Version in 1611 endeavored to speak to their readers. This edition shall not add to, nor take from, nor alter the communication that was the intent of the original translators. All participants in this project agree to sign the statement of faith that the Bible, both Old and New Testaments alone, and the Bible in its entirety, plenary, is the infallible Word of God, and is therefore inerrant, free from error, inspired, God-breathed, Scripture, in the autographs. And if you're not familiar with all those terms, just go back to my lessons on textual criticism. This edition shall not corrupt nor diminish the original translation, but shall endeavor to speak in the late 20th century as simply, clearly, and effectively as possible, all within the format of the original 1611 version, so that the reader of this edition may follow without confusion a reading of the original edition from the pulpit. Okay, so the purpose of this project is to produce an updated English version that follows the sentence structure of the 1611 authorized version as closely as possible. As much as the original King James Version as possible will be preserved. The intention is to clarify the 1611 translation by use of current words, grammar, idioms, and sentence structure so that this edition of the King James Version will speak to the individual reader in a clear and accurate manner. The intention is not to take from or alter the basic communication of the 1611 edition, but to transfer the Elizabethan word forms into 20th century English. And then from here, Arthur Farstad also laid out the guidelines for this translation. The traditional texts of the Greek and Hebrew will be used rather than the modern critical texts based on the Westcott and Hort theory. Because of the continued usage of the traditional texts, the Textus Receptus, and the increasing number of scholars who prefer the usually similar majority text supported by the vast majority of manuscripts, it is important that a version of the Bible based on this text be available in current literary English. So here Farstad mentions for the first time his preferred Greek text, the majority text. We talked about this a bit throughout the class, but it will come up again later in this lesson. Now, up to this point in our history, no one has really done a critical edition of the New Testament based on the majority text, but that's about to change. Or at least not a popular one. Maybe someone else had done it, but I'm pretty sure that these guys are going to pioneer that. In order to accomplish these goals, the following guidelines were followed. Retain all doctrinal and theological words unless a Greek or Hebrew clearly indicates otherwise. Retain words for items no longer in current use, like chariot and phylacteries. Correct all departures from the Textus Receptus, because there are some. Words that have changed meaning since 1611 should be replaced by their modern equivalents. Archaic idioms should be replaced by modern equivalents. 6. Words and expressions that have become vulgar or indelicate in current English should be replaced by their proper equivalent, just like Webster, if you remember him. 7. Alter punctuation to conform with that currently used. 8. Change all Elizabethan pronouns, verb forms, and other archaic words to their current equivalent. 9. To keep the King James word order. However, when comprehension or readability is affected, transpose or revise sentence structure. 10. Eliminate the inordinate usage of the auxiliary verbs shall. Follow current grammatical style for these changes. 11. Attempt to keep sentences reasonably short without affecting text or meaning. 12. Attempt to use words that avoid misunderstanding. 13. When making corrections, use other words already represented by the same Greek or Hebrew word in the King James if possible. 14. Capitalize all personal pronouns referring to deity. 15. Proper names should agree with the Old Testament when possible. 16. All obsolete and archaic words as defined by one or more recognized dictionaries should be replaced by their current equivalents. This applies to phrases and idioms as well. With all that, the 130 translators from two committees, American and British, start the project. Samuel Moore wanted a traditional text, and so the KJV was selected for English. Arthur Farstad believed that the traditional text for the Greek New Testament was significantly older than the Textus Receptus, and with his friend and right-hand man, which is Zane Hodges, that's this man, so we got Arthur Farstad and Zane Hodges. With his right-hand man, they produced the majority text Greek New Testament. This was brand new to the market. Up to this point, most scholars had favored critical editions produced by reasoned eclecticism over the Textus Receptus, but there was a growing and there was a growing interest in the majority text, which would be later developed into what we now call the Byzantine priority text. This majority text Greek New Testament is what Farstad wanted to base the NKJV off of. So he wanted this to be his base Greek text. Zane Hodges, however, was concerned about changing the KJV so drastically since there are about 2,000 differences between the majority text and the Textus Receptus. And since the majority text was brand new and hadn't been vetted by other scholars yet, Zane was concerned that the NKJV would be rejected based on new scholarship that hadn't been tried, or inferior scholarship was his worst fear. Hodges opposed his friend's concern, and ultimately the decision fell to Samuel Moore. Now, just to be clear, Zane Hodges is not on the translation team. He's just working with these people, like a consultant, if you will. Samuel Moore's experience with tradition was the KJV, and he was convinced that if this was going to be a new KJV, then it would needed to be translated from the same base text to retain that tradition. Farstad was overruled, and so he turned to the margins, and all the places where the TR and the majority text and the UBS NA text departed from each other was footnoted in the margin. So here I just put together like a kind of a heads up, if you will. Oh, I didn't mean to put that red line on front. That should have been hidden behind. Oh, well. This is sort of a revision history of the major critical editions that people use today. So this goes up to 1982. So you have Erasmus's Greek New Testament, Stephanus's Greek New Testament, Beza's Greek New Testament, Elsevier's, John Mills, and then you have a loose connection to that with the Scrivener Greek New Testament, because Scrivener had a different project in mind. His wasn't the same as these guys. These guys are working towards finding out what the autographs were saying. He's just trying to figure out what the KJV translator selected. So slightly different purpose there. Very similar, but still different, and still different purpose. Meanwhile, you've got, I forgot to put Lockman up here. Oh, well, Lockman, I think, comes first. And then you've got Constantine Tischendorf, and then you got Tregelles, and then you got Westcott and Hort, and then you got the Nestle-Ahlens and the UBS, which share the same main text. Their apparatus is the only thing that's different. And then the new kid to the block, the majority text. And so just to be clear, none of these graphics contain all the various additions and updates. We covered that when we talked about the Textus Receptus. This is more like just a summary and to give you a visual of what the critical editions look like and the kind of camps people kind of formed around these three critical editions. And if you want to understand the differences and how it impacts our New Testament, the best thing you can do if you want to stay within my class is to go back to lesson 56 and listen all the way through to 72, and you'll get a background of all of this information and how it impacts our Bibles today. So as you read through this translation, you will look at the footnotes, and when you look at the footnotes, you'll see letter designations like TR, NU, and M. Those are the three camps that are designated in the footnotes. So letting you know where the textual variants exist. And then, as you might have picked up on, Farstad and Hodges, they would prefer the majority text readings when they show up in that margin. $4.5 million, and 7 years later, which happens to be the same amount of time it took the KJV translators to complete their revision of the Bishop's Bible, 2 new revisions hit the market: the NKJV in America and the Revised Authorized Version in the UK. The Revised Authorized Version came from the British company, and the NKJV came from the American company. They were the exact same text with only some minor differences. The RAV had British spellings of words instead of American, and the RAV also didn't capitalize the deity pronouns because that was more of a fad in America than it was in the UK at the time. And that fad was primarily kicked off because of the NASB's influence. The RAV was name that because in the UK, the KJV was almost always universally called the authorized version. So they thought it would be received better if it was marketed as the revised authorized version. However, it kind of had the opposite effect. Because this translation was not commissioned by the Church of England nor by Cambridge, they did not receive it there as an authorized version, but an unauthorized version. And other people began to confuse it with the RV and the ERV, causing further confusion. Or I should say the RV or ERV, causing further confusion, which was an authorized revision. The NKJV, however, in the States did very well and it was widely received. The NKJV received one update in 1984, which is the current edition. And with that, they phased out the RAV from their product line and unified the NKJV product line, or the NKJV as one standard translation. So here we see that the KJV gets an unofficial revision to the NKJV, or you understand what I'm saying. The NKJV is an unofficial revision of the KJV, and that's why I put those dots there, distinct from dashes. They're not really, it's kind of based on it. It's more loosely based, whereas the NKJV is a hard based, but it's just an unofficial revision, where these are all more official. Okay. Or public domain, which I left that one that way as well. Okay. And the KJV is public domain in America, but not in the UK. And also, interestingly enough, Cambridge nor the Crown seem to have any issues with the NKJV being marketed as the revised authorized version. It seems like because they didn't use the Crown seal or anything like that, and I guess they did attempt to make it clear that this wasn't coming from the Church of England or Cambridge, that they didn't bother to get involved, which I'm good with. I'm glad they didn't, but that's how that seemed to have gone down. All right, so now let's get into the preface. In the preface to the 1611 edition, the translators of the authorized version, known popularly as the King James Bible, state that it was not their purpose to make a new translation, but to make a good one better. And I think this is great. Samuel Moore and Farstad saw this as the fifth major, albeit unofficial, revision to the KJV. They weren't seeking to make a new translation. They were just seeking to make a good one, which is the KJV, better. And then they go on to say, in harmony with the purpose of the KJV scholars, the translators and editors of the present work have not pursued a goal of innovation. They have perceived the Holy Bible, the New King James Version, as a continuation of the labors of the earlier translators. And this is just right in line with the KJV revising the Bishop's Bible, revising the previous Bible, and so on and so forth, going all the way back to Tyndale. These are all revisions moving the text forward. It didn't stop with the KJV, and the NKJV translators believe they're part of that process. The next section of the NKJV preface is a lot of praise for the KJV and the things that they are going to attempt to retain. And then the section after that one deals with the translation philosophy that they call complete equivalence, which is just their fancy way of saying they're going to be a more formal side of the spectrum when it comes to translation philosophy. The King James scholars readily appreciated the intrinsic beauty of divine revelation. They accordingly disciplined their talents to render well-chosen English words of their time, as well as graceful, often musical arrangement of the language, which has stirred the hearts of Bible readers through the years. The translators, the committees, and the editor of the present edition, while sensitive to the late 20th century English idiom, and while adhering faithfully to the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek text, have sought to maintain those lyrical and devotional qualities that are so highly regarded in the authorized version. This devotional quality is especially apparent in the poetic and prophetic books, although even the relatively plain style of the Gospels and epistles cannot strictly be likened, as sometimes suggested, to modern newspaper style. The Koine Greek of the New Testament is influenced by the Hebrew background of the writers, for whom the Gospel narratives were not merely flat utterance, but also often sung in various degrees of rhythm. So they're just touting that the KJV translators elevated the style, and they were motivated to do that by the Greek and Hebrew. The section after this deals with the devotional quality of the KJV and speaks about the KJV's meter and rhythm more, and as much as they would seek to retain that. That's what they were trying to go with. I will say it's somewhat impossible to retain the rhythm and meter of the KJV because we lack the verb endings that the KJV had. For example, the eth and est endings, which turn most verbs into rhyming words, even if they don't rhyme. They will with the eth and est endings, so you can't do that as well in modern English. So it's almost impossible to get that back. Well, I don't think we'll ever get that back. And you can kind of hear that rhythm in like Psalm 1:1 in the KJV. Listen to the endings and how they beat off of each other. So blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. Blessed, walketh, standeth, sitteth. As compared to the NKJV in modern English, blessed is the man, or blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. Still very nice, just not the same rhythm, that beat on that ending, on those endings, on the eth, and even the essid in blessed, where today we would just say blessed. We don't say blessed. If we say blessed, it's because of the KJV. But modern English just says blessed. Okay? Here they're addressing the style of the language of the KJV, and the style part of the preface goes on further like this. So they say, students of the Bible applaud the timeless devotional character of our historic Bible, yet it is also universally understood that our language, like all living languages, has undergone profound change since 1611. Subsequent revisions of the King James Bible have sought to keep abreast of changes in English speech. The present work is a further step toward this objective. Where obsolescence and other reading difficulties exist, present-day vocabulary, punctuation, and grammar have been carefully integrated. Words representing ancient objects such as chariot and phylactery have no modern substitutes and therefore are retained. That's a couple of times they've mentioned chariot and phylactery. I'm sure there's probably something going on in this timeline, in this time frame, in which chariot and phylactery someone has changed it and they're objecting to that change. I'm not sure. I'm not sure the background of that. I'm sure it's something. I didn't look into it. I probably should have. It would have been an interesting rabbit trail for me. A study for another day. But they go on to talk about how they plan to handle transliteration of people and places. And then they go on to talk about how they're going to handle technical theological terms, all stuff we've talked about before. And here they're going to go on to address the TY pronouns that we discussed before and how they're going to handle them. So let's read this section. Readers of the Authorized Version will immediately be struck by the absence of several pronouns. Thee, thou, and ye are replaced by the simple you. While your and yours are substituted for thy and thine as applicable, thee, thou, thy, and thine were once forms of address to express special relationship to human as well as divine persons. These pronouns are no longer part of our language. However, reverence for God in the present work is preserved by capitaling pronouns including you, your, and yours, which refer to him. Additionally, capitalization of these pronouns benefits the reader by clearly distinguishing divine and human persons in a passage Without such capitalizations, the distinction is often obscure because the antecedent of a pronoun is not always clear in the English translation. I'm going to tackle this more with a later translation. We've already tackled capitalization of deity pronouns in the NASB class. We touched on it there, and but it was in that class in which I showed you guys that the NASB 77 and the RSV switched the thee thou distinction from plural singular to reverence to God. And that seems to be what the NKJV translators are talking about here, which to me is odd because this is a revision of the KJV, and the KJV's use of the thee thou distinction has nothing to do with giving reverence to God. It has everything to do with the plural singular distinction of the second person pronoun. So to me, this is a big whiff on the NKJV translators. And I say that because it is the only translation that I'm aware of that doesn't do anything at all to clue the reader into the distinction in places where the plural singular distinction is going to impact your understanding of the text. So if you're coming into this video new just for the NKJV and you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to go back to my lesson on the NASB 77 and the NASB 95, which is lesson number 79, where I deal with this issue more in depth. And I'm going to cover it again briefly when I deal with another translation that also capitalizes deity pronouns. And I'll kind of round out that discussion of deity pronouns between my discussion on the NASB 77 and this later one. Not going to deal with it now for the sake of time, and because I want to tackle that, especially there because of how they do it. So, so is this a big deal? Well, not really, provided you are doing what I've been demonstrating you should be doing from the beginning of class, which is using multiple translations, not just one. So if you are using the NKJV exclusively, then I would suggest you grab another translation for a multitude of reasons, but even the KJV to help you with this situation specifically with the dealing with the TY plural singular pronouns. And so that's that. The next section right after this deals with how they're going to handle the eth and est verb endings. We're going to skip that one and we're going to go to the format. So the format of the New King James Version is designed to enhance the vividness and devotional quality of the subject, the devotional quality of the Holy Scriptures. Here they're going to say that they're going to use subject headings, which we call pericopes. They talk about their use of italics. We have covered this as well. If you go back to my lessons 43 and 44, you can see italics introduced and explained in more detail. They use poetic format, which is great. A great improvement on the KJV. It's one of my biggest complaints about the KJV is the lack of poetic format. So yeah, poetic format. And then they go into the use of the all caps, small caps for Lord, Lord, for the divine name. Another feature we have covered, if you go back to lesson 16, we covered this feature in translations. And then the highlighted section. In the present edition, the name is so capitalized whenever the covenant name is quoted in the New Testament from a passage in the Old Testament. The highlighted section lets the reader know that when the Old Testament is being quoted in the New Testament and the divine name was employed in the Old Testament that they're quoting, they will use the all caps in the New Testament as well in the quote. And I have to say, I love this feature, and I also understand why nearly no other translation does this. All right, and let me explain to you what I'm talking about. I also talked about this in lesson 16, though I think I might have said that the LSB is the only translation I knew of that marks the New Testament quotes of the Old Testament divine name. That was incorrect, or incomplete, I should say, because the NKJV does it as well. And I think the example I gave in lesson 16 is like one of two places where the KJV also does it. And so in this case, and that example I gave back then was Psalm 110:1. and the KJV does indicate it there, but almost no other Old Testament verse does the KJV capitalize the deity pronoun in the New Testament, except for when it's quoting Psalm 110:1. So here, I picked a different example, and I'll show you what happened. And I explain in lesson 16 why translations don't do the all caps in the New Testament when the New Testament is quoting the Old Testament using the divine name, because they use a common term for kurios, and they make no distinction between a kurios that refers to the divine name and a normal kurios, Lord. So there's no distinction between um, a human that they would call Lord or God that they call Lord. They just use kurios, okay? And the Old Testament actually does have a distinction. So it makes sense to do it in the Old Testament. It's harder to justify in the New Testament. The other thing I want to point out here is that the NKJV identifies. Well, before I get into that, let me show you what's happening here. So in John 1:23, which is where I'm quoting, which is a cross reference to Isaiah 43. It's quoting Isaiah 43. The KJV says, "Here I am, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord," no caps, as said the prophet Isaiah. The NKJV says, he said, "I am the voice of the one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord," all caps, as the prophet Isaiah said. And then the LSB does it this way. He said, "I am a voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord," with the footnote that tells you that this is Yahweh, as Isaiah the prophet said. Okay? So here, I'm just showing you how the NKJV capitalizes the word Lord. So now, the other thing I want to point out here is the NKJV identifies that it's quoting from the Old Testament. Most translations don't indicate when they're quoting from the Old Testament, but in a quoting from the Old Testament in the New Testament, a few translations do. The NASB does it. The NASB family does it by using all caps, like it's yelling at you. But you will notice that the use of all caps would prevent you from identifying the divine name if they wanted to do it the same way that the NKJV does it, which I'm okay with them not doing it. I actually prefer the footnote over the all caps, because I'll explain in a section in a second. But I do prefer the footnotes like they already do, and that's how I'd like it to be done. The CSB uses bold font to let you know that the Old Testament is being quoted. And the NKJV uses oblique font to quote from the Old Testament, which looks awfully similar to their italics. And it's making it almost impossible to tell the difference between what's in italics added for clarity and what's an Old Testament quote. This isn't a big deal when you see a whole phrase. You can tell that it's an Old Testament quote. But what you don't know, and what makes it difficult, is you can't tell if there's italics in the quote, like if they added words for clarity. Now, I've already talked about italics. I'm not a huge fan of them to begin with, but I think this muddies the water if you're going to have a translation that uses italics. Quoting the Old Testament in italics makes it harder. So you can compare. This is the word "am" here. "Am" is added for clarity, and then it's abutted right up against the Old Testament quote. And it could look like, if it wasn't for this quotation mark here, especially, it could look like this was all part of an Old Testament quote. And also, you can't tell in here if they're using italics inside the quote. It makes it really difficult. Online versions, it as far as I'm concerned, even the one I have up here, it is impossible to tell the difference. Print versions are only marginally better. Okay, so the print versions are just a little bit better in this situation. As far as indicating Old Testament quotes in the New Testament, I do like the bold font if you're gonna do something like that. I don't mind italics to quote the Old Testament as long as you aren't using italics as another feature in your Bible. So If you're using italics, then don't use italics or oblique font to do the Old Testament quote. I don't like the system of the all caps at all, because it does feel like it's yelling at you. And it also makes it look like all of the lords, every time the Lord is being used, could be a reference to the divine name, even when that's not the case. So, that being said, as far as indicating Old Testament quotes in the New Testament, if you're going to do anything at all, I would prefer you to do only italics if you don't do italics, or bold, or a combination of both like the NET does. That's fine too. Or nothing at all is better than the all caps. I don't like the all caps at all. That's my personal preference. If you like it, great, good on you. It's just not something I'm a fan of. Okay, so going back to the preface, the next sections cover the textual basis for the Old and New Testaments. We've covered that a lot in detail throughout the class, but I want to hit the second to last paragraph. Today's scholars agree that the science of New Testament textual criticism is in a state of flux. Very few scholars still favor the Textus Receptus as such, and then often for its historical prestige as the text of Luther, Calvin, Tyndale, and the King James Version. For about a century, most have followed the critical text, so-called because it is edited according to the specific principles of textual criticism, which depends heavily on the Alexandrian type of text. We've talked about text types and Alexandrian texts, which now are just shown to be a misnomer. The NKJV, due to its date, is outdated a bit on some of this information. More recently, so it's a bit out of date. Okay, now back to the preface. More recently, many have abandoned this critical text, which is quite similar to the one edited by Westcott and Hort, for one that is more eclectic. All right, so KJV onlyism was probably at its peak in the mid 80s and 90s as far as rhetoric was concerned and popularity, not people using the KJV. The KJV has been historically a popular translation in the 20th century, but it's still a popular translation. But the translation being popular doesn't equivocate to KJV onlyism. KJV onlyism as a philosophy, as an ideal, was definitely at its peak in the mid 80s and mid 90s, which is the generation I was born into, and the pastors that were heavily influenced by that were all pastors I had up until recently. And so some of this rhetoric is feeding into this preface because I can feel that tension. But going back to the preface, it says, finally, a small but growing number of scholars prefer the majority text, which is close to the traditional text, except in Revelation. That's true. There has been an increase in popularity in the Byzantine text priority position. It is certainly the minority in scholarship, but it is still more popular in scholarship than TR onlyism. And as far as that comment about Revelation, part of that is because there's no such thing as a majority text in Revelation. There are about 3 different streams, roughly, or clusters, or whatever you want to call them, families. There's 3 major readings sources for Revelation today, and none of them are the majority in and of themselves. So that makes that more difficult for this comparison. All right. So the next part of the preface is going to talk about how this is, in their mind, the 5th major revision of the KJV. And I'm not going to get into that because we've already talked about it. But because of that, because of the height of the KJV onlyism during this time, a lot of KJV only lies and misinformation spread and is still being repeated today. And I have to tell you, I'm kind of weary of dealing with KJV only rhetoric. That is just awful. The arguments they will use against other versions are almost never applied to themselves. Oftentimes you'll just get called names instead of actually reasoning with you. Not all KJV onlyists, okay? There are some decent ones out there, but the majority are not charitable at all. They generally don't have, they generally have presuppositions that are unfalsifiable. I saw a post just today that said, God told me the KJV is his word. Okay, sure, it is. Not the way I think you mean it to think it is, but um, yeah. Anyway, I know I'm not supposed to be weary and well doing according to Galatians 6:9, and I know it's the right thing to do to refute misinformation and slander. And maybe it's just because I have a cold, but preparing this lesson especially wore me out, not just physically, but spiritually. I want unity with my brothers and sisters that use the KJV, even if they use it exclusively. But the unfortunate fact is that they divide from us because we don't use it exclusively. Um, so, anyway, there's a lot of false rhetoric out there regarding the KJV, and I was planning on taking time to refute it, but instead, I'm just going to share with you some resources so that you can go and listen to it being refuted for yourself. Um, there's no need for me to reinvent the wheel. I have already on, so here, like they've got why were 16 verses left out of the NKJV. That's not true. There are 0 verses in the KJV that aren't in the NKJV. Never use the KJV, which is evil. Never ever use the KJV, which is evil. And then I got this graphic up here, which is this. And then thankfully, someone stepped in and said, it's so sad false claims are made that are so easily proven wrong. Yes, I agree with you. Thank you. And here, New King James omissions. It omits the word Lord 66 times, God 51 times. Da 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 da. I'm going to give you a resource to refute this. The resource that I'm going to give you to refute this, though, doesn't deal. I don't think it does. It's been a while since I watched the video, but I don't think it deals with the last 2 arguments here. The NKJV ignored the KJV Textus Receptus over 1,200 times. I did refute this. And you can go and listen to my lesson 58 on is the that the NKJV is a Textus Receptus translation, and I handle this one. I also watched a video, I don't know, a few months ago that made the claim that the KJV changed over 8,000 words. Well, yeah, it's a revision and it's making synonymous terms. Um, I'll circle back to that in just a second. And then the other argument that they make is the NKJV replaced the KJV Hebrew with the corrupt Stuttgart Old Testament. I actually handled this one from the King James Bible Research Council in lesson 26, the Masoretic Text Examined. So if you want to go to lesson 58 to see how I handle this one, and lesson 26 to handle this one, you'll go and hear refutations for that argument. Now, with this one and all of these, most of these, the list that they're making the claim here, 8,000 differences and all of these omissions and so on and so forth, most of this is going to boil down primarily to the fact that they don't like synonyms. For example, NKJV omits the word devils entirely. It was replaced with the word demons. Okay, so apparently you can't. Demons and devils must be different things. They're synonymous words. I'm not going to get into all of these, and here's why. Because this is Scott Ingram. Okay, Pastor Scott Ingram. He is a pastor and he preaches from the NKJV, and he has a YouTube ministry in which he defends the NKJV from KJV only rhetoric. He handles this topic so well. You can see he's got his list up here. He handles this topic so well that if you're interested in this discussion and learning more about it, just search YouTube for Does the NKJV Remove the Word Lord, God, Heaven? I think I just did to refine the video. I said, Does the NKJV remove the word hell? And his video came right up. So he handles this topic really well. You should go watch it, be edified by his content. I'm going to move past this for the sake of time. And then this next one is the next most common argument that I hear come up when it comes to the NKJV, where they want to lump it in with other modern translations because they want to suggest that it's actually a critical, uh, it's a critical Bible. It's another modern translation disguising itself as a TR Bible. Is conspiracy theories. Um, and here the question is: are you saved? Or are you being saved? Because the KJV says, "For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved, it is the power of God." While the NKJV says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." So, are being saved, like they all say, or are saved. Um, okay, so the problem here is the grammatical structure of "are being saved" didn't exist until 1611. And I don't think that the present continuous passive tense, um, I'm nearly certain it didn't exist in 1611. And the OED cites the "are being" construction is first used in English around 1780, about 170 years after the KJV was translated. And the "are being" construction was still being argued over its proper use by grammarians in 1870. And they were arguing with regard to whether or not it's proper English. And that was what, a little over 100 years ago, 140 years ago. Um, so today, the construction is part of standard English. The KJV translators had to find ways to express the Greek grammar here. So, for example, in 1 Peter 3:20, you'll see which sometime were disobedient when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was a preparing, wherein a few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water, where the NKJV says, who were formerly disobedient when the divine long suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. So uh, it's the exact same Greek construction here as it is here. And you can see that the KJV translators are coming up with ways to express the Greek here. And they're also said they were fine with using synonyms and things of that nature. And so "are saved," like when something is saved, you are saved, or something that is being saved, you are saved, it's still being saved. The ark was preparing, was being prepared. How else are you supposed to interpret "was preparing"? It was being prepared. It's the same Greek construction, and the way you would interpret this should be the way you would interpret this as well. They just didn't have that construction. Okay, it didn't exist yet, so they had to use what they had. However, I'm giving you like a real brief overview. There's even more to this, and you can watch Dwayne Green. He's been on the on this lesson series before. We've seen clips from him and my friend Mark Ward. Also, they discuss does the N Mark Ward and Dwayne Green. They discuss, does the NKJV teach us false doctrine about salvation? Dwayne Green is also a pastor who uses the NKJV, and he goes on the defense for the NKJV as well due to this attack. And if you want to know, if you want a more thorough defense, this one will get you here. There are more issues, but you will soon realize that the KJVO hatred for the NKJV is really rooted in their own commitment to the KJV only persuasion. Any perceived flaw in the NKJV, whether it's valid or not, is enough to swear off the entire translation, unlike what the KJV translator said, in which they said all translations are flawed, but you have to judge the work by its greater portion, not by its warts or scars. So when I see a wart or a scar, like, hey, the NKJV doesn't distinguish between the plural, singular, second person pronouns, that's a wart or a scar, but I'm not going to swear off the whole NKJV because of that. That's a flaw. But the NKJV as a whole is good and acceptable. and it's not a tool of Satan, and it's not a gateway drug into modern versions for those who fear their kids will become heretics by using a modern version. Me being one of them. Um, so, um, and also, I don't think any translation is perfect. That includes the NKJV and my preferred translation and the KJV. Um, so moving on. That's enough of that. Uh, the last part of the preface I want to cover is probably my favorite part, where significant variations occur in the New Testament Greek manuscript. Textual notes are classified as follows. The NU text, there are variations from the traditional text, generally represent the Alexandrian or Egyptian type text. You can ignore those types of terms. They've been handled in newer scholarship. The New Testament texts, they are found in the critical text published in the 26th edition of the Nestle-Aland New Testament. Again, some outdated resource here. The 26th edition was what was available in 1984. But today we're on the 28th edition with the 29th edition coming out soon. So some of the footnotes are going to be dated because there have been some changes. So occasionally in the NKJV, you'll see a footnote to an NU reading that's not in the NU anymore. It's now in the footnote instead of in the text. Okay. M text, this symbol indicates a point of variation in the majority text from the traditional text, as also previously discussed in the New Testament text. It should be noted that the M stands for whatever reading is printed in the published Greek New Testament according to the majority text, which was Farstad and Zane's text. So that's what they're going with. There are other majority texts out there besides theirs now today, but theirs was the one that they were referring to then. So you wouldn't you would need to have their text to match their NKJV footnote because there are new majority and Byzantine texts out today. Okay, according to the majority text, whether supported by overwhelming, strong, or divided majority textual tradition, because some readings don't have a majority, some are divided 50-50 or something close to that. The textual notes reflect the scholarship of the past 150 years and will assist the reader to observe the variations between the different manuscript traditions of the New Testament, which is great. It's why I love it. Such information is generally not available in English translations of the New Testament. The way they do it as textual families, these camps, they're still really the only ones that do it that way, and I really appreciate that. It's probably my favorite feature of the NKJV. The NKJV is for me a regular go-to, almost a daily reference. I go to the NKJV whenever I want to look up textual criticism stuff, and so I often will use the NKJV just to see what camps are the variation is going to fall into, and then I'll use other translations to figure out whether what kind of manuscripts it might be in or things of that nature. Are they older? Are they different? Are so on and so forth. And so when you look down at your footnote at the NKJV, you'll see notes. These notes, I think they're immensely helpful, even though some of them are dated. They don't mention it here, but their footnotes for the Old Testament are also really well with regard to Kettiv and Kier readings. And if you forget what the Kettiv and Kier readings are, go back to my lesson on the Masoretic text and you can get reminded about that. It also has footnotes on Septuagint readings and Dead Sea Scroll readings. All around, NKJV has great footnotes when it comes to textual criticism. And so I really appreciate that. And that's it for the NKJV. As you can see here, it's right next to the KJV as far as translation philosophy. And you can argue about whether or not it should be slightly more formal or slightly less formal. That's fine. The problem with charts like this is it's really hard to convey how similar all of these translations are in the centrist position. I will show you later. It's not as dramatic as a chart like this one that I've created makes it look. But that is what it is. Um, here's the formal side, here's the functional side, and you can argue about which one should go where if you want to. This is just my personal view on it. Take it or leave it. But as far as picking a primary translation, the New King James Version is a green flag translation. Um, it is it a translation made up of evangelical Protestant Christians who can affirm the Apostles' Creed and Nicene Creed? Yes, it is. Are source language scholars engaging with this translation in their commentaries? Yes, they are. Have local churches largely adopted this translation for public worship? Very much so. Is non canonical material clearly identified? It certainly is. Is this translation being maintained? Sort of. It's not as though that a revision is impossible. For example, I'll mention a Bible that isn't being maintained that is newer in its revision, which is like the WEB, the World English Bible. They have a later revision, but they've said openly that they're not going to produce physical Bibles any further with new revisions. They would only do notes of uh, updates in their online resource on their particular website. So technically, to me, that's not being maintained anymore. Now, the NKJV is older than that one, but Nelson has a number of times, not just Nelson, but other people a number of times have sent out polls asking whether or not the NKJV should be updated. So I know it's on their mind to have it updated, and it hasn't been updated in over 40 years. And so it's getting to the point where they really ought to do an update soon. I would say if they don't do an update in the next 20 years or so, then to me, I might have to move this one to a yellow flag translation at that point, because going 60 years without doing an update, language is going to have changed by that point. And I can already demonstrate that. We've already been demonstrating that with the use of gender language and pronouns and things of that nature. So at some point, I hope Thomas Nelson considers doing an update, even if it's a light revision, just to remind people that one, translations aren't perfect, so we don't end up in only a situation when updates stop happening, and also just to help clear up any language issues. Is the translation within the centrist spectrum for translation philosophy? Yes, it is. And does this translation have a track record? Yes, it does. So the NKJV is a great Bible, green flag Bible, if you want to use it as your primary translation, along with the other green flag translations we've discussed in this series. I'm going to try to do another one this week, but no promises. If I get around to it, great. If not, I'm still going to release them in the order of the intent, even on Sunday I might get ahead of myself a little bit. Online they will be in order still. All right, that's it for this class. Thank you. You all are dismissed.